Fate often works in mysterious ways, weaving together lives in the most unexpected circumstances. It was a night like any other when two strangers crossed paths. One act of courage, a rescue, would forge an unbreakable bond, leading them to uncover long-buried secrets and a shared past they never knew existed. Little did they realize that moment of danger was only the beginning of a journey that would change the course of their lives forever. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways, and the rain fell in sheets, turning the city streets into slick rivers of asphalt. Michael had never been the type to get involved in other people's problems, especially not after a long day at the construction site. But as he rounded the corner near the old train station, something made him stop in his tracks. A woman was standing under the flickering streetlight, her face pale with fear. Her eyes darted around as though she were looking for a way to escape. Two men loomed close, their intentions clear from their aggressive posture. The threat was real, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Without thinking, Michael stepped forward. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. The men turned toward him, sizing him up, but they hadn't expected anyone to intervene. Michael wasn't a large man, but he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who knew how to take care of himself. "Leave her alone." There was a brief standoff, tension crackling in the air. But as the seconds passed, the two men decided it wasn't worth the trouble. With a sneer, they retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the night. The woman, trembling and drenched, stared at Michael with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "It's all right," Michael interrupted gently, holding out his hand to steady her. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of the rain." She nodded, too shaken to argue. Together they made their way to a small coffee shop on the corner, its neon sign casting a soft glow through the fogged-up windows. Once inside, the warmth of the place enveloped them, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. They sat across from each other at a small booth, the steam from their coffee swirling in the air between them. Michael took a closer look at the woman, noting her soaked clothes and disheveled appearance. She was beautiful, but there was a haunted look in her eyes, something deeper than just the events of that night. "What happened back there?" Michael asked, his voice calm and steady. The woman took a deep breath, her hands wrapped tightly around the coffee mug. "I was walking home from work. I've been taking this route for months, and I've never had a problem before. But tonight, I don't know. Those men, they started following me a few blocks back. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. But then they started getting closer, and I panicked." Her voice cracked slightly, and she took a sip of coffee to steady herself. "I should have called for help, but I froze. I didn't know what to do." Michael nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. "You did the right thing by staying calm. I'm glad I was there." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe? But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm Emma," she said quietly. "Michael," he replied, with a small smile. For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, the storm outside providing a backdrop to their quiet conversation. Despite the circumstances, Michael felt a strange sense of calm in Emma's presence, as if this wasn't the first time their paths had crossed. "I can't shake the feeling that I know you from somewhere," Emma said suddenly, her brow furrowed in thought. "Have we met before?" Michael blinked in surprise. He'd been feeling the same thing. "I don't think so," he said slowly. "But now that you mention it, you do seem familiar." Emma laughed softly, though there was an edge of nervousness to it. Maybe it's just one of those weird coincidences, or maybe we've seen each other in passing. Could be, Michael agreed, though something deep down told him it was more than just coincidence. Over the next few days, their lives became unexpectedly intertwined. Emma reached out to thank him again, and they met for coffee, a much more relaxed meeting this time. Conversation came easily, and they found themselves laughing and sharing stories as if they'd known each other for years. As they spent more time together, they began to realize just how much they had in common. Both had grown up in small towns and moved to the city to escape their pasts. Both had struggled to find their footing in a world that often felt too big and too indifferent. And both had carried the weight of loss. Emma had lost her brother in a tragic accident years ago, and Michael had been estranged from his family after a falling out. It was during one of their long conversations that Emma brought up something that had been nagging at her. "You know, Michael," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what we said that first night, about how familiar we seemed to each other." Michael looked up from his coffee, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Yeah?" Emma bit her lip, unsure how to proceed. "I think we might have known each other before. I mean, before all this. It's just, there's this memory I keep coming back to." Michael leaned forward, intrigued. "What memory?" Emma took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "When I was a kid, my family used to go to this little cabin by the lake every summer. There was a boy who lived next door. He was a few years older than me, but we used to play together all the time. His name was Michael, too." Michael's brow furrowed as he listened, something stirring in the back of his mind. "Go on," he said softly. Emma smiled faintly, her eyes distant as she recalled the memory. "He was my best friend for those summers. We would spend hours by the water, skipping stones and building forts. But then one year, he just didn't come back. I never knew what happened to him." Michael felt his heart skip a beat. A flood of memories came rushing back. Memories he had buried long ago. "The cabin by the lake," he said slowly. "Was it in Cedar Ridge?" Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Yes," she whispered. "How did you know?" Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Because I was that boy, Emma. I was the Michael who lived next door." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the revelation settling between them like a thick fog. Emma's mind raced, trying to process the impossible truth. How could she have forgotten him? And how had their lives brought them back together after all these years? As they continued to talk, they pieced together the fragments of their shared past. Michael had stopped going to the cabin after his parents' divorce, and the family had moved to another part of the state. He had never returned, and over time, those summers by the lake had become a distant, hazy memory. For Emma, those summers had been some of the happiest times of her childhood, and when Michael had disappeared from her life, it had left a hole that nothing else had ever quite filled. Now, sitting across from him all these years later, she realized that part of her had been searching for him ever since. "It's strange," Emma said quietly, her eyes searching his face. "All this time, we've been living in the same city, and we never knew." Michael nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around the coincidence. "Maybe it wasn't time for us to meet again until now." There was a pause, and then Emma smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Maybe you're right." Their relationship deepened in the weeks that followed. The bond they had formed as children had resurfaced, but now it was stronger, more profound. There was an undeniable connection between them, a sense that they were meant to be in each other's lives. As they grew closer, Michael and Emma began to revisit the memories of their past, even taking a trip back to Cedar Ridge. The old cabins were still there, though much had changed. Walking along the shore of the lake, they felt the weight of their shared history, the years that had passed, and the journey that had led them back to each other. But their story was far from over. Just as they were beginning to settle into their newfound bond, the shadows of the past began to resurface. There was something Emma hadn't told Michael, something about her brother's accident, something she had been running from for years, and Michael, too, had secrets he wasn't ready to share. Secrets about his family, about why he had really left Cedar Ridge all those years ago. As they stood on the edge of a new beginning, the past threatened to pull them under once again. Would they be able to face the truth together, or would the weight of their buried secrets tear them apart? The storm that had brought them together was far from over, and the journey that lay ahead would test them in ways they had never imagined.